You know, with how loved the open-air style of Zelda's been, it's pretty interesting that the final new game to use the Ocarina of Time style was, for a long while, probably the most divisive and hated Zelda game ever. The critics loved Skyward Sword, but plenty of fans weren't exactly happy about things like the heavily forced motion controls, as well as how linear and even hand-holdy it was compared to previous games. And honestly, all of those were pretty fair criticisms. Back in 2021, though, we saw the release of Skyward Sword HD, which, with the exception of the aforementioned linearity, actually corrected most of those issues to arguably the best of its ability. Plenty of people weren't happy about the price point and how quality of life functionality was locked behind a limited amiibo, which is honestly fair enough to be upset over, but this is pretty much the definitive version of the game. With how much time's passed and the barriers to entry now basically gone, Skyward Sword started receiving a lot more love in recent years, which makes me pretty happy because I still think it's easily one of the series' greatest entries. I mean, heck, I would argue that Skyward Sword does some things better than even Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom do, despite them all being very different games. So sit back and relax while I explain to you why, despite being the most flawed 3D Zelda game, Skyward Sword was a wonderful end for the Zelda series' previous formula. The story of Skyward Sword takes place at the very beginning of the series. A very long time ago, during the era of the goddess Hylia, a fissure in the earth opened, releasing a horde of monsters led by the Demon King Demise. In order to keep the sacred and reality-warping power of the Triforce away from the Demon King, Hylia sent it, along with the remnants of humanity, into the sky on a massive chunk of land that would later be known as Skyloft. Many years later, we now have this era's Link, who, after discovering he's the goddess's chosen hero, goes on a journey to save Zelda after a not-so-coincidental tornado makes her fall to the surface during the annual Wings ceremony. For as mostly basic as all of this is for a Zelda game, Skyward Sword stands out from nearly every one of them with how much more of an emphasis it has on the whole story. And this is where we get to my first big reason for why Skyward Sword is so great. The relationship between Link and Zelda is much more important and even personal this time around. The game makes sure you know that these two aren't strangers to each other in the slightest. They're childhood friends who definitely have a thing for each other. It makes the journey to find her all the more personal. This isn't just some princess you have to save. This is someone much more emotionally important who, for a lot of reasons, really needs your help. It's a take on their relationship so good, it's only been surpassed by their most recent incarnations for me. Honestly though, I love the writing for nearly everyone in this game. Side characters like Scrapper the Robo-Simp, trust me it makes sense in context, and even Groose, a bully who actually has a full-on, well-written character arc, are all really charming and have a lot of personality. But no one in Skyward Sword has more personality than our main villain and the self-proclaimed demon lord, Girahim. This guy is an absolute joy to have on screen. He's flamboyant, delightfully unhinged, and he owns every scene he's in. I can't go too deep into it for fear of spoilers, but Girahim's a fantastic villain, and a reminder that no matter how much I love him, it's always great when we get villains in the series that aren't Ganondorf. With that being said though, we can't talk about Skyward Sword's characters without talking about easily its most divisive one, Fi. Fi is the spirit of the Goddess Sword, a weapon forged by Hylia for the hero to use, and she became fairly infamous and even hated for how much she held your hand and interrupted you with her advice in the original version of the game. In Skyward Sword HD though, along with cutscenes being skippable now and item descriptions no longer being repeated, Fi was also changed so that she doesn't force advice on you nearly as much as what she did previously, which is a massive improvement for the game's overall pacing. For me though, while she's definitely no Midna, I always really liked Fi as a companion as well as a character. Her more robotic and logical personality can make her come across as kinda snarky at points. And even if I feel like they could have done a bit more with her, she definitely had her moments, especially towards the end. There's more to praise, but just like with Girahim, I can't really talk more about it without fear of spoilers. But Skyward Sword really does have easily one of the strongest stories in the series. I may generally be a gameplay first, story second kind of guy, depending on what it is we're talking about, but I firmly believe a well-handled story can make an adventure all the better and more memorable for the player. And Skyward Sword's extra emphasis on the story really helps to elevate the whole game. Like any normal Zelda game, you'll be exploring the world and side-questing in between objectives for heart pieces as well as other upgrades. But things are a bit different here with Skyward Sword. For starters, unlike the other games, you don't have a massive inventory to store items in from the start. Instead, you have an adventure pouch that starts with 4 slots and can be upgraded to a max of 8 by finding or buying extra pouches. Secondly, let's talk about some changes made to items, starting with shields. For the first time in the series, shields now break, and you have up to 3 different kinds you'll be able to buy over time from Skyloft's Bazaar. Unlike in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom though, you can restore any lost durability with either revitalizing potions or by visiting Gondo and Skyloft. On the note of him though, in another series first, he can also upgrade your shields and other dungeon items or gear. By finding certain materials in the field or from defeated enemies, you can upgrade most important items once or even twice, and you can even do the same thing for potions by catching insects. Upgrading your shields is always a good idea so you can get more durability out of them, as well as potions for stronger effects like more healing. But aside from the bug net and bow, you'll probably be fine if you didn't upgrade anything else. Now, as for exploring the actual world itself, this is unfortunately where we get into one of Skyward Sword's bigger problems. Starting with the positives though, I do like each of the game's 3 regions. Aside from Lanayru Desert with its time shift mechanic, the other 2 are a bit bland in design, but I do think they all at least look nice. I also love each region's native races, especially the Kikwi, because, well, I mean, just look at them. They're pudgy little bush birds. Some people don't like having to revisit each of them 3 times throughout the game, and I totally get where they're coming from. While I like the new areas you unlock on almost each revisit, I can imagine a lot of people would absolutely rather just have an entirely new area altogether. Personally though, my biggest issue, for as much as I hate to say this, is that out of every 3D Zelda, Skyward Sword's exploration is definitely the weakest. There are the goddess cubes you can hit with a Skyward Strike to unlock the sky's goddess chests, but given the sheer size of these things and the way each region is designed, I can promise you most of these aren't even remotely hard to find at all. A vast majority of collectibles like heart pieces will be found in the sky, but the reality is that it's not much better. In fact, it's actually much worse, because the sky is definitely the weakest aspect of the game. Most of the 27 goddess chests are just located on tiny pieces of land that are usually spread out pretty far from each other. Beyond those, we only have a couple of mini-games for rupees and materials, as well as the Lumpy Pumpkin and Skyloft for side quests. Getting new stuff from the goddess chests and doing side quests was fun, of course, but I couldn't help but wish there were more things to do or find. With that being said though, on what is now a less controversial note, before we move on, let's finally discuss the one thing I'm sure a good number of you have been waiting for me to talk about with the controls. Before, in the Wii version of Skyward Sword, you had no choice but to use the motion controls, which, as you can easily imagine by this point, was a pretty controversial choice. But here in the Switch version, that's no longer the case. To address this problem, the devs have introduced a new buttons-only mode where you can control the sword with the right stick instead. Now, while I didn't use them for this playthrough, I can say for sure that they work great, so for those of you that have some kind of physical impairment, or just really do not want to mess with them, you have nothing to worry about. I gotta say though, while this is probably an unpopular opinion, I actually prefer using the motion controls. Don't get me wrong, in many respects the button controls are easier to use since some of the Wii's motion control jank is still present, but I really like how immersive they can feel. Skyward Sword's combat already feels great to me because of its focus on reading the enemy to find an opening, but with the motion controls, I just feel so much more involved, like I'm the one physically swinging the sword and parrying with the shield. Heck, it also makes some of Skyward Sword's better boss fights even better for me. And actually, on a related note, no matter how you may feel about this game, I think at least a majority of you can agree with me that even to this day, Skyward Sword has some of the best designed dungeons in the series. Even the weakest dungeon in the game, Skyview Temple, has something really cool going for it, with how it uses the motion controls for some puzzles and how cool both its boss and mini-boss are. Like, to this day, Skyward Sword has my favorite version of Stalfos to fight, and the battle with Girahim at the end is a great introduction for the game's main villain, and it's easily one of the best first bosses in the series. To avoid making the video longer than necessary though, I won't be going over every dungeon. Instead, I'll just be focusing on 2 of the best in the game, and even the entire series. Starting with probably the more famous of the 2, the Ancient Cistern. The Ancient Cistern is very heavily inspired by Buddhism, and it makes for one of the most visually creative and interesting dungeons in a Zelda game. Let me tell ya, the tonal whiplash you get going from the sacred and peaceful feeling top floor down to the dark and eerie basement filled with zombie bokoblins and a river of poison is one most players won't forget. The fight at the end with Kalaktos is just as great now as it was when the game first came out. It is a very unique design, and I love how the fight changes once you get to Phase 2. Deal enough damage to his core after removing his arms, and Kalaktos decides to finally get serious by standing up, lowering a gate on his core, and pulling out 6 massive swords that you then have to use against him after yanking off one of his arms. Honestly, the only problem I have is that the dungeon's main item, the whip, unfortunately isn't too useful outside the Ancient Cistern. It's not that big a deal since up to this point this is kinda normal for Zelda, but it is a shame. If you want to see what I think is the most mechanically interesting dungeon in the game though, then look no further than the Sand Ship. Earlier in the game, there was a dungeon called the Lanayru Mining Facility that played with the usage of the region's time shift stones. But the Sand Ship takes that a step further. Here, instead of shifting individual rooms and parts of the floor, the Sand Ship revolves around one central stone on the crow's nest that shifts the entire ship into the past. The first half of the dungeon takes place predominantly in the present until you beat the mid-boss and get the bow. After that, you'll be using it to alternate between the two time periods, so you can start up the ship's engine and free these captured robots in order to get the boss key. It's a mechanically very well designed and interesting dungeon that uses the bow in its most creative way yet, but unfortunately it has one kinda glaring weak point. Once you head to the center of the ship with the boss key, a storm starts and the room's suddenly pierced by large tentacles. After you fight your way up to the deck in one of the coolest build-ups for a boss in the series yet, you're then met with this. Ladies, gentlemen, and non-binary pals, say hello to Tantalus, the most out-of-place looking boss in all of Zelda. I mean, for real though, I have no idea what the dev team was thinking with this guy. It's fine that he isn't super intimidating visually. I think the build-up and tone could have still worked if he was a bit goofy. I'm just not a fan of the fact that he looks like a rejected Monsters, Inc. character. It's honestly a shame too, because aside from the design, I think Tantalus is a fun fight. It's certainly nothing amazing, but it's definitely good. If the next open-world Zelda has ocean and underwater exploration, I'd love for them to give this guy a redesign and the Gleeok treatment, because I really think he deserved better. With all that being said though, this wouldn't be a Skyward Sword video if I didn't bring up the Silent Realms at all. During the game's second third, you'll need to get a gift from the goddess Hylia in order to explore more of a specific region. In order to get said gift, you'll need to collect 15 tears in the Silent Realm, a space where only Link's spirit may enter. The Silent Realms have a very nice and serene atmosphere with some of the most calm-sounding music in the game. But don't let this fool you. Once you collect a tear, you have 90 seconds to collect another one. Fail, step in waking water, or get caught by watchers and you'll trigger the Silent Realms Guardians, invisible enemies that kill you in one shot. Get hit by them at any point and you'll have to start the whole trial over again. The Silent Realms aren't too hard at all, but I'd be lying if I said they were a totally relaxing experience. These can get extremely anxiety-inducing, especially when you actually wake up the Guardians and you have to make a mad dash to the nearest tier. Honestly though, these are the most fun I've had with a stealth section in a Zelda game before. They're definitely a highlight for me. Unfortunately though, it's finally time we get to the game's other biggest issue, padding, starting with the infamous Imprisoned. The Imprisoned is the twisted, sealed form of the Demon King Hylia fought so long ago, and he's earned quite the name for himself. See, the reason he ties into Skyward Sword's padding problem is purely for how many times you're required to fight him. Over the course of the game, you'll have 3 separate encounters with the Imprisoned, 2 of which can be nearly back-to-back from each other. While I can defend and justify the first 2 fights since they're important to Groos's character arc, the last fight is entirely unnecessary, and none of this would be so bad if the Imprisoned's fight wasn't as hated as it is. Fighting the Imprisoned requires you to smack the ceiling spike on his head back into his skull 3 times before he can escape the pit. The first method for fighting him is to pop his toes in order to knock him over, but doing so will get you constantly knocked over by his stomps. Success, however, forces you to take a fairly long-winded route to get to his head, so instead you can take the infinitely less annoying route and just jump on his head from a level above him without all the hassle. The padding, of course, doesn't stop there, though. For starters, there's the revisit to the game's first dungeon. The in-a-nutshell version here is that in order to get to the Ancient Cistern, you first need to help heal the water dragon by bringing her a bottle of sacred water from Skyview Temple's spring. It's not hard at all, but the added obstacle of now having a new key to find in order to progress in the dungeon makes the entire section feel a bit tedious and even unnecessary. Then there's the section before the game's 6th dungeon, the Fire Sanctuary. Long story short, the entry is blocked by flames, so you have to head over to Faron Woods to grab the water dragon's basin with Scrapper's help to put it out. Unfortunately, he gets ahead of himself and heads to the foot of the mountain instead of the summit. What follows is a surprise escort mission where you have to defend Scrapper while you run to the dungeon. As a quick pro tip, the bow is your best friend here. Sniping enemies instead of fighting them head-on will save you so much headache, so I also recommend upgrading it at least once before going here for the extra range and attack power. The worst of it, though, is the fact that almost the entire last third of the game is padding, even if I do kind of enjoy it. The whole deal is that in order to get into the place Hylia hid the Triforce, you need the Song of the Hero, which has been split into 3 pieces, each held by that region's guardian dragon. I won't go over everything that happens in this section, but the problem here is that you don't really get anything out of this beyond the Song of the Hero and an optional boss rush from the Dragon Lanayru for a couple of admittedly pretty good rewards. It's definitely not as bad as Wind Waker's Triforce Hunt, but even if I do still enjoy Skyward Sword's last third, this combined with the last Imprisoned fight, the Sacred Water Fetch quest, and the whole section with Scrapper really just breaks the game's pacing. For as much as I love Skyward Sword HD, I can still pretty easily understand why some people wouldn't like this game. Heck, I'm sure at least a few of you watching probably thought at some point that I wasn't hard enough on it, and I can't even blame you for thinking that way. The changes they made to Fi, repeated dialogue, as well as cutscenes were great, and the addition of button controls basically erased the game's biggest barrier to entry. But I can't pretend like the remaster erases Skyward Sword's other issues. Even now, there's still a good number of elements in the game that people are understandably a bit divided over, like the exploration, the area design, and all of the padding. Heck, there's probably a bunch of other little things I didn't bring up that bother some of you currently watching this video, but I think at least most of us can agree that Skyward Sword still has one of the best stories in the series and a pretty spectacular set of dungeons. Frankly, I think the game is worth a try just for those elements alone. I definitely recommend checking out the HD remaster if you're interested, especially if Tears of the Kingdom's dungeons or story left you burned earlier this year, because even if I liked them, I can promise you Skyward Sword will give you a better experience in that regard. Thank you all for watching, like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and I hope you all have a nice day.